All right, let's pick up from where we left off, where I mentioned that while Jody is showing jealousy and possessiveness over Janie, he isn't completely evil or really evil at all. He's just flawed. And we're going to see that in the upcoming scene where he does something good. So let's take a look at it. So late one afternoon, we're starting halfway through the page. Late one afternoon, Matt came up from the west with a halter in his hand. "Been hunting for my mule. Anybody seen him?" he asked. "Seen him this morning over behind the schoolhouse," Lem said. "About 10 o'clock or so. He must have been out all night to be way over there that early." "He was," Matt answered. "Seen him last night, but I couldn't catch him. I'm obliged to get him in tonight, 'cause I got some plowing first in the morning. Done promised to plow Thompson's Grove." "Reckon you'll ever get through the job with a mule in that frame?" Lige asked. That mule's plenty strong. Just evil and don't want to be led." "That's right. They tell me he brought you here to this town. Say you started in Mechanipe, but the mule had better sense and brought you here instead." "It's a lie. I set out for this town when I left West Florida." "You mean to tell me you rode that mule all the way from West Florida down here?" "Sure did, Lige. But he didn't mean to. He was satisfied up there, but the mule wasn't. So one morning he straddled a mule, and he took and brought him off. Mule had sense. Folks up that way don't eat biscuit bread but once a week." There was always a little seriousness behind the teasing of Matt. So when he got huffed and walked off, nobody minded. He was known to buy side meat by the slice, carried home little bags of meal and flour in his hand. He didn't seem to mind too much so long as it didn't cost him anything. About half an hour after he left, they heard the braying of the mule at the edge of the woods. He was coming past the store very soon. "Let's catch Matt's mule for him and have some fun." "Now, Lum, you know that mule ain't a messin' to let himself be caught. Let's watch you do it." When the mule was in front of the store, Lum went out and tackled him. The brute jerked up his head. The brute is another word for a mule. The brute jerked up his head, laid back his ears, and rushed to the attack. Lum had to run for safety. 5 or 6 more men left the porch and surrounded the fractious beast, goosing him in the sides and making him show his temper. But he had more spirit left than body. He was soon panting and heaving from the effort of spinning his old carcass about. Everybody was having fun at the mule baiting, all but Janie. So I want you guys to think about, why does Janie get upset on the mule's behalf? She, Janie, snatched her head away from the spectacle and began muttering to herself. "They ought to be ashamed of themselves, teasing that poor brute beast like they is. Done been worked to death. Done had his disposition ruined with mistreatment. And now they got to finish devilish him to death. I wish I had my way with them all." She walked away from the porch and found something to busy herself with in the back of the store. So she did not hear Jody when he stopped laughing. She didn't know that he had heard her, but she did hear him yell out, "Lum, God, that's enough. Y'all done had your fun now. Stop your foolishness and go tell Matt Bonner I wants to have a talk with him right away." Janie came back out front and sat down. She didn't say anything, and neither did Joe. But after a while, he looked down at his feet and said, "Janie, I reckon you better go fetch them old black gaiters. These tan shoes set my feet on fire. Plenty room in 'em, but they hurts regardless." She got up without a word and went off for the shoes. A little war of defense for helpless things was going on inside her. People ought to have some regard for helpless things. She wanted to fight about it. "But I hates disagreement and confusion, so I better not talk. It makes it hard to get along." She didn't hurry back. She fumbled around long enough to get her face straight. When she got back, Joe was talking with Matt. $15? I got you's a crazy Betsy bug. $5. Lest we struck a compromise, Brother Mayor. Let's make it 10. $5. Joe rolled his cigar in his mouth and rolled his eyes away indifferently. "If that mule is worth something to you, Brother Mayor, he's worth more to me. More special when I got a job of work tomorrow. $5. "All right, Brother Mayor, if you wants to rob a poor man like everything he got to make with a living with, I'll take the $5. That mule been with me 23 years. It's mighty hard." So let's talk about why Janie gets upset on the mule's behalf. So Janie identifies with the mule. When she mentions that the mule's been worked to death and has suffered mistreatment, She identifies because she feels as though she's being worked to death in the store and being mistreated. And therefore, when the mule is being teased and bullied and hurt by the men, it reminds her of how Jody treats her. Now, Jody, however, defends the mule on her behalf, and he asks her to get his shoes because he wants to kind of hide the fact that he's going to buy this mule and make her happy. And Janie, however, she perceives him asking her to get her shoes as another example of how she's being worked to death and mistreated. And she kind of grumbles to herself and she feels helpless, but she doesn't want to cause trouble, so she doesn't argue with him. And so we see this tension between them, but Jody's actually trying to do something good to make her happy. So let's see how it turns out. Mayor Starks deliberately changed his shoes before he reached into his pocket for the money. By that time, Matt was wringing and twisting like a hen on a hot brick. But as soon as his hand closed on the money, his face broke into a grin. Beat you trading that time, Starks. That mule is liable to die dead before a week is out. You won't get no work out of him. Didn't buy him for the no work. This is Jody speaking. I bought that varmint to let him rest. You didn't have gumption enough to do it. A respectful silence fell on the place. Sam looked at Joe and said, That's a new idea about varmints. Mayor Starks, but I likes it my own self. It's a noble thing you've done. Everybody agreed with that. Janie stood still a while. They all made comments. When it was all done, she stood in front of Joe and said, Jody, that was a mighty fine thing for you to do. Ain't everybody would have thought of it, 'cause it ain't no everyday thought. Freeing that mule makes you mighty big man out of you, something like George Washington and Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln, he had the whole United States to rule, so he freed the Negroes. You got a town, so you freed the mule. You have to have power to free things, and that makes you like a king or something. Hambo said, Your wife is a born orator, Starks. Us never knowed that before. She put just the right words to our thoughts. Joe bit down hard on a cigar and beamed all around, but he never said a word. The town talked it for 3 days, and said that's just what they would have done if they had been rich men like Joe Starks. Anyhow, a free mule in the town was something new to talk about. Starks piled fodder under the big tree near the porch, and the mule was usually around the store like the other citizens. Nearly everybody took the habit of fetching along a handful of fodder to throw on the pile. He, the mule, almost got fat, and they took great pride in him. So let's pause there and talk about what does Jody do for the mule, and how do people react. So Jody buys the mule so that it can rest, and he does this to please Janie. So he doesn't buy the mule to work it, he buys the mule so that it can just be lazy and walk around and be happy. And this makes Janie happy, like he plans for it. And Janie, when she realizes what Jody has done, she compares Jody to Abraham Lincoln, saying just as Abraham Lincoln had freed people from slavery, so too has Jody freed the mule from being forced to work to death. And the town is really impressed by Jody. And they also are really happy with this idea of the mule being freed. The town takes pride in the mule and they start feeding him until he's fat. And this is because the town, just like Janie, sees something of themselves in the mule, where this mule was made to work and work and work and finally gets a happy ever after, just like they hope they'll get a happy ever after in their life. Now let's continue reading. Yes, this mule that they have, the fat mule, the happy mule, symbolizes freedom for them. All right, let's keep going. New lies sprung up about his free mule doings. How he pushed open Lindsay's kitchen door and slept in the place one night, and so this is all the mule having a really good time and a happy life, and fought until they made coffee for his breakfast. How the mule stuck his head into the person's window while the family was at the table, and Miss Person mistook him for the Reverend Person and handed him a plate. The mule ran Miss Tooley off of the croquette ground for having such an ugly shape. The mule ran and caught up with Becky Anderson on the way to Maitland so as to keep his head out of the sun under an umbrella. The mule got tired of listening to Redmond's long-winded prayer and went inside the Baptist church and broke up the meeting. The mule did everything but let himself be bridled and visit Matt Bonner. But way after a while, the mule died. So pay attention to how does the town react when the mule dies, and why do they react this way. Lum found him under the big tree on his raw bony back with all 4 feet up in the air. This wasn't natural, and it didn't look right, but Sam said it would have been more unnatural for him to have laid down on his side and died like any other beast. The mule had seen death coming and had stood its ground and fought it like a natural man. The mule had fought it to the last breath. Naturally, he didn't have time to straighten himself out. Death had to take him like it found him. When the news got around, it was like the end of a war or something like that. Everybody that could knock off from work to stand around and talk. But finally, there was nothing to do but drag the mule out like all other dead brutes. Drag him out to the edge of the hammock, which was far enough off to satisfy sanitary conditions in the town. The rest was up to the buzzards. Everybody was going to the dragging out. The news had got to Mayor Starks out of bed before time. His pair of gray horses was under the tree, and the men were fooling with the gear when Janie arrived out of the store with Joe's breakfast. "Ay, God, Lum, you fasten up this store good before you leave, you hear me?" He was eating fast and talking with one eye out of the door on the operations. "What are you telling him to fasten up for, Jody?" Janie asked, surprised. "'Cause it won't be nobody here to look after the store. I'm going to the dragging out myself." "Ain't nothing so important I gotta do today, Jody. How come I can't go along with you to the dragging out?" Joe was struck speechless for a minute. "Why, Janie, you wouldn't be seen at the dragging out, would ya?" So really quickly, if you're confused by what the dragging out is, that's the ceremony that they're going to have for the mule because it's died. With any and everybody in the pastel pushing and shoving with they no manner selves? Nah. You would be there with me, wouldn't you? That's right, but I'm a man, even if I was the mayor. But the mayor's wife is something different again. Anyhow, they's liable need me to say a few words over the carcass, this being a special case. But you ain't going off in all that mess of commonness. I'm surprised at you for asking." He wiped his lips off a ham gravy and put on his hat. "Shut the door behind you, Janie. Lum is too busy with the horses." After more shouting of advice and orders and useless comments, the town escorted the carcass off. No, the carcass moved off with the town and left Janie standing in the doorway. Out in the swamp, they made great ceremony over the mule. They mocked everything to death. Starks led off with a great eulogy on our departed citizen, our most distinguished citizen, and the grief he left behind him, and the people loved the speech. It made him more solid than building the schoolhouse had done. He stood on the distended belly of the mule for a platform and made gestures. When he stepped down, they hoisted Sam up, and he talked about the mule as a school teacher first. Then he set his hat like John Pearson and imitated his preaching. He spoke of the joys of mule heaven, to which the dear brother departed his valley of sorrows. So note how nothing has changed. Jody still refuses to let Janie participate in the dragging out or the ceremony for the mule's death. And it's because he doesn't think that it's her place to be there. So even though Jody freed the mule, bought the mule so that the mule could have a happy end of his life, that doesn't mean that Jody has changed in how he's going to treat Janie. He still thinks that her place is at home and away from these kind of matters. And so, again, while Jody loves Janie and tries to show it in his own ways, it's not how Janie wants to be loved because she feels as though she's being left out. So let's pick back up. The Mule Angels flying around, the miles of green corn and cool water, a pasture of pure bran with a river of molasses running through it, and most glorious of all, no Matt Bonner with plow lines and halters to come in and corrupt. Up there, Mule Angels would have people to ride on, and from his place beside the glittering throne, the dear departed brother would look down into hell and see the devil plowing Matt Bonner all day long, in a hell-hot sun and laying the rawhide to his back. So that's a sermon that one of the people at the ceremony said in honor of the mule. So I'm going to pause here. I was hoping to finish in this video, but I have a little bit left to read, so the next video is probably going to be like 3 minutes or something. But go ahead, finish this video and move on to the next one, and we'll finish off this section of Chapter 6.